Good afternoon. Welcome to the contingency planning workshop, following on from last week's session when we looked at a little bit more high level of contingency planning. And I'm going to try and get into a bit more detail today. Just help me out when you join. If you don't mind, jump in the chat. Just let me know that you're online. And if there's anything specific you want to cover, let me know. Or if you've ever specific question, you can put it into the ask a question. But if you're online, just let me know that you're there, and I'd be interested to know where people are listening in from today. So so just let me know. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a little bit of a presentation just to hit some of the key points. But what I'm really interested in is trying to answer your questions and help you develop a contingency plan. Hey, John. So as we go through this, what I'll be doing is looking at the high level principles involved in building a plan. So feel free to jump in and let me know the kind of challenges you're having. What I probably can't do today is explain how you can build a specific plan for your organization, because that's a whole other level of engagement that we probably can't do in this setting. There may be an option for that. I'm going to do a different workshop next week where we can maybe do that. But for example, if you're having a challenge about scenario planning, or having a challenge about working out what the courses of action would be, just let me know, and we can dive into that. I'm going to go for about 20 or 30 minutes with the presentation part. But like I said, if you have questions or comments, jump in there. And then if there's any specific questions at the end, we can get to those. So I am just gonna open up this presentation. Okay, and I'm just curious if you are joining, how many people were on last week's session? Because we are going to cover some of the same things, but like I said, try and get into a little bit more detail. So if you were in last week's session, let me know. And if you feel that we're going over the same stuff, just hit me up in the chat and let me know. Okay. So I want to look at the development this week. Just to put this into context, where the contingency plans fit from my perspective, the top level of the organization, you'll have a crisis management plan. The contingency plan is scenario specific or situation specific. That's going to sit in the middle. And then underneath that, you're going to have a series of processes and procedures, or SOPs, that you can then use to execute the plan. So the CMP is the top level document. That should be situation neutral. That's really just going to give you the OS operating system for your response. What we're talking about today is contingency plans. So they're for a specific situation, mapping out the how the scenario could develop, looking at the course of action you could follow, and then you'll have the CMP will give you direction, and the tools and SOPs that you have are actually the things that you will use to go through and execute on the contingency plan. And then these processes and procedures, I look at those like a golf bag or a toolkit. You can go and grab the one that you need. So if you need to do mass notification, you have a process for that. If you need to do a product recall, you have a process for that. Telework, shelter in place, business continuity plans, or the components of a business continuity plan. Those are all the tools that you have. And so right now, a lot of people are already working at how to do remote telework, how to maintain customer service when they can't be in the physical workplace, etc. So a lot of those will fall into that SOPs and tools element. So we brushed over this last week, and this is what I really want to get into in a little bit more detail. And there's a few things I want to stress on this. Contingency plan development isn't necessarily particularly complicated. The plan itself can be fairly straightforward. The hard thing often is to try to work out how things could develop, and therefore the specific scenarios you could be dealing with. In most of this, the challenge is going to be on the execution side. So when it actually comes to executing the plan, that's where things really start to get difficult, because even though we have a plan in place to begin with, it can only give us the top level direction. And then when the situation hits and we start to execute on that plan, there's still going to have to be adjustments made along the way. Clearly, there's no way we can plan right now, today, or there was no way we could have planned a couple of months ago exactly how coronavirus was going to develop. We could have had a pandemic plan. We could have had elements in place for shelter in place, work from home, etc. But we were always going to have to adjust those as the spread of the virus became clear, as how it manifested itself, where it hit hardest. We were always going to have to make some adjustments. So the point is, you're putting a plan in place, but that plan will have to be adjusted once you start on the execution side of things. So we're looking for, first of all, we want to have the best understanding possible we can of what the challenge is and how it might develop. I'll talk about that in a minute. We should always have an idea what our end state and objectives are, and those could change during the event itself. So depending upon how things develop, say at the national level, you may have to adjust your expectations of what you're trying to do. But you're going to have that at the end. That's like your North Star that you're going to be following along, and that really goes back to your company's, your organization's mission, your values, etc. When we have the situation, so we can use coronavirus, or we could use, I was working on something this morning and I used typhoons as an example. That's the situation, but we then need to understand what the scenarios could be. How could that develop? So we're going to map out the scenarios, and I'll talk about that in a second, and then what courses of action we would take. So if we see this scenario, say the worst case scenario, what options do we have then? What courses of actions do we have? And we need to have those laid out, because those essentially are the core of the plan that you're going to execute on at the end, or when the thing occurs, sorry. And some of these other things we'll get into in a moment. I don't want to go through this whole list, but essentially what we're trying to put together is the plan that when we see the situation develop, we pull out that plan and we start to look at how do we think it could develop, what scenario path do we think we're on, if we're on that scenario path, what decision points do we have, and what course of action does that lead us to. And when we get to that course of action, we've mapped that out as well. I'll talk about how we do that. You already have the core of your actual response built out, and then, as I said, you need to adapt that for the specifics of the exact specifics of the situation, but you've got the core elements of your plan built already. So that's what I'm talking about in as far as contingency planning is concerned. So I'm going to jump into the details a little bit now. So the situation and scenario mapping. Whatever the situation is, I like to start with, let's describe the situation we could be facing. So in this case, it's a global pandemic, could be a storm season, something like that. And then we start asking, so what? So the point is to start asking, what does that mean? How could that develop? What does that mean for us? How is that going to affect our business? And so you see, I've put a couple of examples there, and you just keep asking, so what? So what you're trying to do is get down to the point to say, the answer to the so what is, therefore I have to do X, I have to do Y, we should plan for Z. And what that allows you to do is then say, okay, what do we need to have reflected in our contingency plan, in those courses of action? Asking so what over and over and over will actually help you drill down. So in this case, disrupting factories in coastal regions, so what? It's going to interrupt manufacturing, so what? Delay fulfillment, and on you go. And once you've sort of run that one down and you feel that you've really got into the detail there and you've got a couple of specific actions, jump back up to the high level. Okay, so we'll also prevent staff from coming to work, so what? And then you start to drill back down. And you can keep doing this and start to get a sense of what the impacts would be. And then what you can do is you can then take that and then look at the different scenarios. But at the first point is to keep asking, so what, and break it down. If you have a plan that just says there could be hurricanes, that doesn't really mean anything, because we don't know what the impact would be. Global pandemic, we don't know what the impact could be. We don't know what we're planning for. So you have to ask, so what? And you have to ask that in the context of, so what does that mean for us? So what does that mean for organizations? So what does that mean for operations? How might that affect our overall objective? So that's why you're asking, so what? Because this is highly subjective. So everyone is going to be affected by this situation very differently. And I think I've used the example previously of civil unrest. Most organizations in a time of tension, that is a negative risk. It is going to impact them negatively. But if you're a security company, it's an opportunity. So that's an extreme example, but the point is it's quite subjective, and the same situation will affect every organization and group quite differently. So by asking so what each time, that's helping you drill down and understand, so what does this mean for us? What does this mean for our business? What does this mean for our people? So once we've done that, we're going to be able to break the situation down and get a few different scenarios. And we want these scenarios to be quite diverse. We don't want 3 scenarios that basically are all kind of the same. I've just used the words likely, worst case, and best case scenario here. You may use different terms for it. It might not necessarily be the best and worst case. You might just have 3 very different options that come up, and you want to figure out how to tackle them. The point of having the different pathways is that if you have 2 or 3 paths that all generally look the same, you probably haven't looked at the extremes. Now, we hope we're not going to have to operate in the extremes, but by looking at the extremes, we've prepared ourselves. Remember, this is contingency planning. We are preparing for the worst, so there's no point doing contingency planning and assuming that everything will be basically okay. Everything will be basically the same. So what we're going to end up having is 3 different pathways, 3 different scenarios. So, and again, an example using typhoons or hurricanes, let's say the likely case is that there is landfall. It's not going to hit our operations directly, so there's some secondary damage, and we're going to work through that. The worst case scenario is a direct hit and enormous damage. And the best case scenario is essentially it burns out somewhere in offshore, and we have a lot of wind and storm surge and rain, but we don't really have a hurricane or typhoon hitting. So that gives you these 3 very different options to consider. And what actually happens will be somewhere in between those 3. So it's somewhere between essentially nothing and a direct hit. But by having these 3 scenarios mapped out, as I said, you're going to adjust when things actually happen. That's going to give you those courses of action that you can then start to use for your planning. So while you're doing this, the other thing is look for and identify the triggers. So what conditions indicate that you're on that path? So again, to go back to storms, it would be, we're now in storm season. We know that storm season happens at certain times of the year, and therefore we can expect those storms. As far as coronavirus, the trigger was widespread transmission or transmission outside of China, or whatever metrics we have about seeing those as triggers, then that's going to push us down a particular path. Sometimes the triggers might be things that are forced upon us. So in a lot of places in the US and other countries, the government is mandating what we need to do. So it's less of a trigger for us to have to identify the trigger and then react. But if we can see the government starting to talk about some kind of restrictions, or it could be for lifting restrictions, once we hear that sort of chatter, that indicates that we're getting towards that trigger, and the trigger would be the final announcement. So we're trying to map those out. So when we see those triggers, we can start to see, okay, we're now moving down that particular path. What should we be doing? And then the last part of the planning, or one of the most detailed parts of the planning, once we have those scenarios, is have a course of action. Now, there should be a separate course of action for each scenario. You may actually have more, even if you have 3 scenarios, you might have 4 or 5 courses of action, because you could have alternate courses of action that you could use depending upon the situation. So you will end up with these courses of action, and essentially what that's trying to do is that, as I said, is the bare bones of your actual plan, the plan that you're going to execute depending upon the situation. And these are the key things you want to have in that course of action. So responsibility is who is responsible for that. So of course, depending upon what you're doing, it may be a different member of your leadership team, a different manager. So you've got to specify who is responsible for that, because they're responsible for the detailed planning of that. And then they're also responsible for executing that plan. So you've got to be clear who is responsible for that course of action. overview, just give a sort of general outline of what the course of action is. It doesn't need to be very long, but just enough so that someone reading it will understand generally what that course of action entails. So it could be shelter in place and move to telework. It could be evacuate people from the affected area. Just a short summary of what that course of action is. When we get to decision points, I'm going to come to those in a moment, but the decision point is essentially at what stage do you need to decide to take that action, to trigger that course of action. And that's quite a complicated, it's not a complicated thing, but it needs a little bit of thought. So I'm going to come back to those in a moment. But you have to specify the decision point for that course of action, clarify the objective, and then have the critical actions. And these two things are key because that objective and those critical action, there's a huge cascade comes out of that, because other people are going to take those actions and be responsible for those. So you have a sort of knock-on effect for the planning cycle. So it's important to stress those in there. And it also helps you look at the plan and say, okay, our objective is to move all of our people to safety. What critical actions do we have to complete to achieve that? So when you're reviewing the plan, you have to then work from the bottom up and say, if we complete these actions, will we have achieved our objective? And that's a good way to stress test the plan before you get into the detail. And again, as a reminder, the course of action is pretty high level. It's not super detailed. So you're going to take that and build a plan from that later on. So you get the objective and critical action. And then with the requirements, it's staffing, it's resources, it could be authority, it could be money. Whatever the key things are, you need to make that work. So if you're going to go to telework, do you have the infrastructure set up so people can telework? Most people have a laptop or something they can use, or a smartphone or a tablet, but have you built the infrastructure in your organization for them to access their details? Without that, it's not going to work. Have you provided authority to the right levels of the organization to make this thing work? If you want to evacuate, how are you going to do that? Do you have an ability to get the resources that you need? So you don't have to specify all of them, but you just have to identify these in the course of action. So essentially, the course of action is a summary of your plan. Who's responsible for it? A general description of what it is. The decision point, which I'm going to talk about in a second. Objective and critical actions, that's key. That's how you're going to measure success. Did we achieve our objective? And what are those stepping stones to get to those? What are the stepping stones to get to that, which are the critical actions? And then what are the key requirements that you need? And the idea is that you would then be able to say to someone, take this course of action, take this summary, and go and build that into a plan. And you can do some of that in advance, or as the situation starts to develop, you might say, okay, now we need to get into the detail and start planning out for each of these courses of action in more detail. Okay, so course of action, we've talked about a bit, but essentially, if X happens, we do Y. So if we see this particular scenario, this is what we're going to do. So there's a pathway between those. The triggers, we're seeing that situation develop. We're going to take that course of action. But the decision point is when we need to make a decision. So if we want to shelter in place and there is a storm coming, our decision point can be relatively close. It could be, six hours or so beforehand, enough time to get people back home, barricade themselves up, to get some basic supplies. If your decision point is to evacuate from an area, you may need to make that decision 24 or 36 hours out, because as you start to get within that 24-hour window, you may not be able to evacuate. If you wanted to switch everyone to telework, you may have had to make that decision 24 hours before it actually happened to give people the chance to get into work, to put the files they have on their desktop into a shared drive, to make sure they've got the right access codes or whatever it is they need to actually telework. You may have had to make that decision 24 hours in advance. If people simply woke up one morning and were told, hey, we're teleworking today, that decision was maybe too late because they're not able to execute it. So the point is, when do we need to make a decision in order to make that course of action successful? And so that will depend upon what the course of action is and how complicated it is, and also how fast the situation is moving. So the decision points are, they're not particularly complicated, but they are very important to map those out, because I said not every decision point is going to fall at the same time. Sometimes you will pass through a decision point and may not even know, and therefore you'll be forced down a particular path. And what I would say is that there is a video I'm going to link to in the notes that I put online. I made it this morning. and it puts all of this into context. So starting with the situation, the triggers, building the scenarios, from the scenarios to the courses of action. So I'll put that in the notes, and I'll share that with everyone in a second. You can watch that, and that will knit it all together. The reason I don't do it on the board right now, it takes me 30 minutes to put together a 5-minute video, and my writing's pretty bad, so I have to go back at it several times. But I'll put that in the notes, and then when you look at that, you'll see how all these things tie together. So what I'm going to do is just go back up here for a second and just review what's going to be in the plan. So we're going to start with an understanding of the situation. And one of the challenges I've got right now, and I just came off a call with some friends of mine who also work in the same sort of industry and consultancy. You know, the challenge is right now, everyone wants a specific answer to their situation, and we can't do that with a 5-minute phone call. We can't give a plan to everyone that will work for everyone, because everyone's facing different challenges right now. Looking at the stats in the US, Amazon has an increase in demand. So Amazon is facing a very different situation than local restaurants, which have had to shut down. New York is very different to Houston right now. So everything is very unique and very individual. So all I'm trying to do here is give you the framework so you can take this framework, analyze the situation, and then apply it to your own organization. And unfortunately, a lot of that relies upon the subject matter expertise that you have for your organization, or that I would only get as a consultant after having spent some time getting to know you. So that's why I can't just pull out the sort of one SOP to rule them all, one contingency plan that will work for everyone. So start with the best understanding possible, and then map out how that might develop. And that's where we're going to have these development paths and the scenarios. And then each of those will lead us down a course of action. Now, what I would say is coronavirus is here. It's very much here. It's in most countries in the world, if not, it's not in every country in the world. It seems that sub-Saharan Africa right now and some of Latin America has not been hit as hard, but it's likely that it will arrive in almost every country before too long. It doesn't mean that we can't contingency plan, because we're still early on, relatively speaking, in what is going to be a months-long event. And we're now having to plan for the immediate effects on us. So I see that somebody here is in the Northeast US. They're probably on lockdown right now and having to do some kind of telework or remote work. We're on lockdown here. I live in Amman, Jordan right now. We're on lockdown. This is our 3rd week. When basically we can't leave the house. But for businesses and organizations, we're going to then have to start contingency planning on what do the next 3 or 4 months look like. So how are we going to manage our organizations and our business over the next 3 or 4 months while we have these interruptions in place? And then what do we do when we go back to normal, or whatever the new normal is, in say 6 or 9 months, when maybe we have a vaccine, maybe we have a way to test people more effectively and quickly, and therefore we have mass movement again, but it's going to be different. So we're contingency planning for what that looks like, because there could be new regulations in place. There could be new travel restrictions in place. There might just not be as much travel. I spoke to someone yesterday who's in the travel industry. They're projecting in some locations down to 20% of flights will go back on, because the airlines don't see the point in going all the way back up to full capacity, because they don't expect people to travel. So how does that affect your business, your organization? So we can still be contingency planning, even though it might feel like we're already in the event and we're just reacting. We're not. We can still contingency plan for how this plays out. So we're going to map out the scenarios, have the course of action. Those are essentially the core of our plans that we're going to have, outlining the responsibilities, the decision points. The objective and critical actions are really, really important, because without those, the person planning won't really be able to make sure that they've achieved the objective with their plan, and then the requirements that are needed, and also limitations, because you may want to put limitations in there. Once you put all that together, then you have your contingency plan. And when you see those triggers on the horizon, when you see the event unfolding, pull it off the shelf, start tracking where you're going, flesh out those courses of action into detailed plans, and then when the time comes, you're gonna execute. So I'm going to stop there for a second. I can see there's a couple of questions down in the question area, but just in the chat, that is a lot. I understand it's a lot. Just give me a sense of where you're at with your plans. What is it that you're looking for now that I've gone through the top level? Is there something you'd like me to jump into? Is there something specific that you're working on that you're hoping for that we can discuss there? Just let me know in the chat, and then I'm going to jump into these questions in a second. Okay, I'm just going to see who's online and then take the work in the questions for the folks who are online. So I've got a question here from Alonge. Let me just go through. So how can organizations develop resilience for infectious disease pandemic outside of outbreak monitoring? So I need to start. I'm not a doctor. I'm not an infectious disease expert. So Alonge, also, if you're online, if you don't mind, would you just jump in the chat and let me know the kind of industry or sector that you're in, because that might help me give you a little bit more of a specific answer. But I think in general terms with resilience, whether it's for infectious disease or anything, the resilience obviously starts way before, by looking at your organization, looking at the points of failure that you have, and then seeing where things could interrupt those. So if you were a very physical business, that becomes much more difficult, which I think is what all of the retailers are finding in a lot of places these days. So it's very difficult for them to build resilience straight away if you're brick and mortar. But I would say, pardon me, obviously the monitoring is important. A lot of that is going to be done by government. If there's not a huge outbreak and there's a stay at home, then I think maybe the next stage would be to say, how can we continue to do business safely for our staff and safely for our clients? So that could be enforcing social distancing. So do people have to come to your business for you to serve them? Can you support them by phone? Can you support them by email? If you're a business, if you're in retail, can you move into delivery? That could be something to consider. And while if you're doing that kind of delivery, then what would you need to put in place for social distancing, sanitization, etc., to make sure that the people who you're delivering to are safe? So I've just seen your oil and gas service sector. So I think that there it can become a little bit more challenging, but there can also be positives. So I've worked a lot in oil and gas, and sometimes some of these sites are very remote and you control movement in and out. So to that point, it could well be that if you're supporting clients, whether it's in remote locations in the oil field or offshore, the positive thing you have there is you have a very controlled pipeline going in and out. So you can actually do monitoring on the way in. You can do temperature checks and things like that. You may want to extend people who are already on a deployment, which is more difficult for them, but it does mean that you know those people are already in a location. If no one is sick and nobody has moved for 14 days, then nobody there is really going to get sick, from what I understand, certainly of the way that this spreads. So you can control some of that there. So in some respects, if you're in the service sector, resilience for you in that respect might be easier because you can actually control a number of these things. Wider thing on resilience is making sure that you have supplies and that you have alternate supply chains and you have a way to move things if some of your suppliers are interrupted, or if transport is interrupted. So if you're reliant upon air freight is being affected by this, because although DHL and others can still operate, a lot of stuff moves in the hold of passenger aircraft. And so with passenger aircraft stopping, then that is something that's going to affect you. So then you need to start thinking about how can you stockpile, or how can you run an alternate supply route, whether that's specific cargo being pushed through something like DHL, or whether you move to your own charter, or even go to containerized movement, which is slower, but it doesn't seem to be affected in quite the same way. And then more broadly, the challenge is that if you are in the service sector, some of the things can be done remotely, but some of the things cannot. But what I have seen in the field is you will often have a number of people who, although they're deployed in the field, a lot of their work is still online. So although they are proximate to, say, a rig or a drill site, they're still essentially running a project plan online. They are still running well monitoring software online. So there may be a delay, but that's something that could be done remotely, and then using video conference if they do need to speak to people on site. You then have the ability to have that one-on-one conversation, but without them being in the same place. So again, that's adding some more resilience, not from the infectious disease itself, because that's going to come down to hygiene and separation, but it's adding resilience to the secondary effects of that, which are the movement restrictions and availability of the people. So that's just some thoughts that I've got on that. I don't know how helpful that would be for you. Any other questions from folks who are here on the chat? So there is one other question here about the security implications on the maritime supply chain. And I have not touched maritime security or supply chains for a long time. So I'm not going to get into the specifics of that. But I think that when we're looking at contingency planning, to go back to the point, this would be the time to then look at, okay, what is this scenario? And how is it manifesting itself? So around this, it's going to be effects on movement, availability of staff. There could actually be an increase in shipping potentially because we're not moving things by air anymore. So there could be a security implication just because you're now pushing more material through the pipeline. The key thing would then be to look at how could this have an effect on you? And it could actually be, in this case, the answer is maybe not very much. There might not be a whole lot of a security implication on the supply chain, other than whether or not key individuals are pulled off because they're sick, or key individuals can't work because there's movement restrictions. But this could be one time where actually that part of the impact might be relatively limited. So I think that's a time, Ignatius, maybe to just sit down, look at the scenario, and then doing the so what questioning. Okay, so are there going to be, is there going to be more traffic? So what does that mean? Are there going to be movement restrictions? So what does that mean? And work through that. But nothing immediately jumps out there at me as the big concern, compared to, for example, how this affects air freight. Like I said, it's moving through passenger aircraft. So there is a much bigger impact there, I think, on that supply chain, and then how that's handled, actually physically handling the mail and things like that, becomes more complicated because of movement restrictions that are in place. So there's a question on site where the client is primary for safety. How do we support our crew? That's a great question. And I think that's a challenge. So going back to Alonge's question here on oil and gas support, that is super complicated, because you will have times, in my experience, where you have a client who is very diligent, and if you work for the oil majors, they are super strict on their health and safety. But there are other times where you have a smaller operator who is not. And frankly, and I'm sure you've seen this, because you are not staff, there is often a them and us as far as how the contractors from the service companies are treated and supported versus the staff members. So I think that the first thing I would do is go back and look at all of the agreements that are in place and just see what those say you're entitled to. So key things would be, do your contractors have access to the clinics that your clients may have? And if not, what would the alternates be? Can you pay for use, or would you have to source your own clinics? The measures that the client is putting in place, as far as any movement restrictions, how might those affect you? That's worth checking on. I think another one would be on medevac. If there was a need to medevac, again, that falls into the contract side. If it's provided, if you can use the client's setup, great. If not, you need to Do you need to arrange your own? But as I said, you're either going to have this Goldilocks, too much or too little. So is something the client demanding, putting an undue burden on you? So is there some kind of pre-quarantine requirement before someone deploys? Do you need to add in a medical check before someone goes? In addition to the normal medical checks you may have to do you have to have some kind of doctor's note saying that they had a test before they can go into the field? Or if there's not a whole lot in place, it's probably relatively straightforward you to add a little bit more on top. So you could get your crew to do their own health checks, do their own temperature checks, have like a buddy-buddy system, and be checking each other to make sure that if anyone's showing any symptoms, that's caught early on, and then have your own sort of quarantine protocol. So essentially, you may have to look at how you build your own set of processes around that if you feel that that the client is not necessarily going to take it to the level that you are comfortable with. But when you've got the client putting in a little bit too much in place, then I think the key thing, or when the client has a lot in place, the key thing would just be to go back and check and say, under the terms of the contract, which of these services can we use? And if it is not in the contract because of the situation, what can we do to extend those to our staff? And if that's not the case, I guess that's when you start reaching out to people like International SOS and folks like that to see what their network looks like as far as additional medical support you might need. Okay, so we've covered a little bit of a range of topics there: maritime supply chain, oil and gas, service sector. If you've got any other questions, jump in now. But what I would just stress is that I'm going to share some things after this that will help get into the detail. And I understand sometimes this is frustrating because often people come on these calls or they come to workshops and they're looking for the plan. And there isn't the plan. There isn't a plan, unfortunately, because the challenges that Alonga is going to face in the oil and gas sector are going to be very difficult. I'm guessing, John, you're in Connecticut, so you're maybe in different sectors dealing with different things. So I can't give you a plan. All I'm trying to do, though, is give you the process that you can follow and the tools that you can use to build a plan for yourself. And a lot of it's going to go back to this thing of, what does this mean for us? The so what? So we've got the situation. So what? What does that mean? And by analyzing the situation using that, then essentially the plan is fill in the blanks. You just fill in the blanks for your organization, your situation, and that's going to give you the core of this plan. I'm just going to take a quick look at this question here. Okay, this is a great question. So would it be best to have a contingency plan for individual security events, or is it appropriate to have a single overarching contingency plan for a variety of incidents, active shooter, bomb threat, and then point back to the roles and responsibilities? Okay. All right, let me think about this for a second and try and think about the best way to map this out. Let me start at the bottom, actually, I think, John, and to go to this point about SOPs, that if you have SOPs in place, the nice thing about an SOP, so let's say it's a building evacuation, getting everyone out of a building broadly looks the same, no matter what the cause is. Now, there will be some differences. For example, if there is a bomb threat, you may direct them away from a certain area if you think that's where the device is, versus a fire where everyone just gets out and goes to the sort of 4 quadrants to go into the assembly areas. Similarly with active shooter, if there's an active shooter in the building, you may have to adjust your movement plan. But you could have a building evacuation SOP with a couple of addendum or a couple of options in there depending upon the situation. So the nice thing is that the active shooter part of that, the evacuation part, would be could be an SOP. And then you've talked about local roles and responsibilities. I think they're a big part of it, particularly in the US, is going to go to local authorities. So then you would need to have a contingency plan in place that would probably say, if this were to happen, and the scenario is, let's say the scenario is active shooter, I guess it's the the most likely is that let's say they're in the building and there are some casualties. The worst case is that there's some kind of siege situation and there are mass casualties. And the best case is that they're neutralized before they get in the building or anything happens. And so a lot of how that's dealt with will come down to local authorities. But then I think you're looking at how do we get people out? How do we get them to a place of safety? And it's what comes next. Because the authorities are going to deal with the building. They're going to deal with the shooter. They're going to, the first responders are going to come with the police and deal with a lot of that. And that's not to say that you won't have anything to do, but a lot of that will be handled for you. But then let's say you've taken hundreds of people out of a building. Where do you take them? How do you support them? How do you get them home? Can you get them home? What other support do you do there? And then longer term, what support are you going to give them? Because clearly that would be something quite traumatic. If you had to evacuate the building because of a bomb threat, then I think you evacuate the building, same basic protocol, but now it could be that you can't go back into the building for several hours. It could potentially be for an extended period. So therefore, do you then need to sort of flip into some kind of remote work, business continuity for essential services? So I'd have to think about that in a little bit more detail about, do you want one big contingency plan? It feels like it would be better to have smaller contingency plans. The reason being that I don't see these plans being really, really thick binders because the big fat binders, nobody's read them. And if they have, they didn't read them in the last 6 years, and so they're out of date and they're hard to use. So I think that the closer you can have something that you pull off the shelf and just start working through on the day is better. So the contingency plan, remember, we're getting to the point where the course of action are the specific steps to take, and those should be nice and crisp. And that's where the SOPs are really useful, because often the contingency plan is we could initiate SOP 1, 2, and 3 for business evacuation, building evacuation, business continuity, and support for people who've been involved in it. So I think in that case, I'd be inclined to say work with the contingency plan could be around, let's say, event at the physical event at the workspace. Let's say you got some contingency plans around that. And those scenarios would then fall in there. You may then have another security plan around a remote event or a cyber event, and then you have contingency plans around that. I think that might be the way to do it, to separate it in some kind of way so that it's easier for someone to pick up the contingency plan and look at it and say, okay, I'm dealing with the physical threats to the building. That's great, that's over here. Because the other thing is the group that owns that is maybe a different group. Like the chief security officer is different from the CISO. So you've then got the chief security officer is going to deal with your physical events and they'll take responsibility for all of that. Your CISO is going to take responsibility for cyber and they will take that. So by separating it out into different documents, I think that might be a little bit more manageable. But just let me know what you think about that and see if that's useful. I think that one I'd have to think a lot. Think on a little bit more. What I would try to avoid, and I was looking at one the other day, which literally was this thick. It was 900 pages, and it was the contingency plan for everything. And it was so big that it was impossible to navigate through it. And as a document, it was impossible to manage. So that just physically managing that document was extremely hard, which essentially meant that it wasn't going to work. So I kind of like the short and simple. And just to go back more broadly, when I'm talking about these contingency plans, they don't have to be really detailed. This is a planning process. You know, we're just trying to say, if this happens, what options do we have, and how do we make those options work? And then the rubber really meets the road when something is inbound. You know, when the hurricane is 20 miles offshore, or you hear the alarm going in the building, or we're told to lock down because of coronavirus. That's really when the plans, you take that course of action and you really have to make that plan work. But you've set yourself up for success. You've identified the responsibility, you've identified the resources that you need, and you've identified what you're trying to do, and so therefore it's much easier to get into the detailed plan. Just taking a look here. Okay, so John, you're handling the physical side. Yeah, I think, and I'm happy to chat offline if you want to shoot me a note to bounce some ideas around. But I kind of like the idea of having these sort of slightly narrower contingency plans, sort of by theme or by group, because I think that's just going to make it a little bit easier to manage and conceptualize. But then, like I said, you know, if we go back and talk about the oil and gas sector very quickly with Alonge, you know, when you get into some of these highly technical things, for example, a spill, you know, spill response plan is going to be a couple of 100 pages long, and a lot of it is the ones that I've seen are like they're just a series of tools. Because until you know where the spill is and you can put a dot on the map, it's all sort of just a series of tools. But once you've put that dot on the map, you then have a physical dot and you have a start point. And then you can just layer all of these tools on top. And so in that case, there is actually a lot of planning that can be done in advance. So that that specific contingency plan could be very, very detailed and built way out in advance. Country evacuation, also something very detailed, could be built way out in advance. Business continuity plans, a lot of that can be built way out in advance. But then what you have to do is look at the specifics of the scenario and decide exactly which elements you're going to execute on. And again, to go back to your point, John, maybe you have this, the physical threats contingency plans, essentially. But some of those can be very specific, because if you know the building, you know where you're going to go if it's a fire, you know where you would avoid, you know where you're going to meet the authorities and the police and the first responders, and so there's a lot of detailed planning that that could maybe be done there. And then on the day, it's a little bit more like working through the checklist. Okay, so I think we've answered all of the questions. For the supply chain, Ignatius, I'm sorry that I can't get into a lot of detail there, but that's something I'm not super comfortable talking about anymore because it's been so long since I've touched it. So I think I'd be going off in the wrong direction. But I hope that to your question, Alonge, and for your question, John, I hope that's helpful. Feel free to hit me up afterwards. What I'm going to do as soon as this is finished is I will share a link. In fact, I'm going to put the link in here now. If you have 7 or 8 minutes, I'm just going to put this in the call to action, and so I've just put watch the explanation video in here, and not quite sure where that turns up, but hopefully it turns up somewhere in your screen. And then if you watch that explanation video, that is going to give you a much better overview of how these things tie together. I didn't want to show the video in the middle of this, but it's going to take a lot of the things that I've touched on and give you a bit more of a detailed understanding of how they tie together for the terms that I've used. But feel free to hit me up with email. I'll share a link to this afterwards. You can go back and watch this again. You can see the presentation that I have. And then next week, it's going to be slightly different, because next week it's going to be a smaller session, and or I'm offering a smaller session if people actually want to jump in and build a plan as we go. So that's going to be much more of a small group session. Unlike these, it's not a free session, because there's a lot of other material that I'm going to be sharing, including tools and templates to actually build the contingency plan. But if anyone's interested in that, it's going to be much more seminar based. And instead of just me being the only one on screen, we'll probably have all the attendees on screen and have much more of a discussion as we walk through putting a plan together. So if that's something that you're interested in, I'll be sharing a link to that shortly. And then prior to the session, a few days out, I'll be sharing some planning tools, a link to a template. You'll be able to work through that. And then when we get on to next week's session, we'll actually work through the plan. If you're stuck on something, we can do that. If you're not sure about the course of action, we can discuss that in a little bit more detail. And then afterwards, you can send me your plan, and I'll run through it, and we can have a discussion of that, just so that people can then walk away with the plan. As I said, in this kind of forum, it's very difficult to give people a specific plan, but I'm hoping with a small group we can really interact much more directly to make sure people walk away with what they need. So I appreciate everyone's time. Thank you for the questions. Some good challenging questions as well. And as I said, specifically, if you want to follow up, just let me know. And happy to chat some more online. And as I said, after this, I'll supply a link which will take you to a group of planning tools that I've put into one place, along with the explanation video to go into this in a little bit more detail. So appreciate your time. Thank you very much. And apologies for those of you, again, where I wasn't able to make yesterday's session, but I appreciate you making the time today. Thanks so much.